Just very briefly, a little bit about the United Methodist Foundation. The foundation was organized in 1949, so last year we celebrated our 70th anniversary in October. Some of you probably were there in Downers Grove when we had about 200 people celebrate with a banquet, and we recognized 7 organizations with $10,000 grants each. We're an independent 501c3, so we are independent from the annual conference, but the annual conference, the local churches of the annual conference, and the annual conference itself are clients and constituents of the foundation, and we partner with other individuals such as Michael Piazza, experts, churches, and organizations that provide several ministry-related services. Mostly what we do is investment management, but we also partner with you to do endowment, genesis, and growth, trustee and custodial services, estate planning, plan giving programs, donor consultation, stewardship development, financial best practices, and ministry grants and scholarships. I'm very proud and honored to say that in the last 12 months, the foundation has granted nearly $175,000 to those 7 organizations in our 70th anniversary celebration. And then over $75,000 in matching grants to the 3 food banks that serve our annual conference in May, and then, of course, to several churches. It is now the grants time, so if your church is looking for a grant of $500 to $2,000 for 2021, the money would come to you in January of 2021. The deadline to submit those applications is September 15th. You would go to the website, and you can either, when the grants window pops up, or go to churches grants. And then the applications and everything you need to know is there. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest presenter today, Reverend Dr. Michael Piazza, who's the senior pastor of the Broadway UCC Church in New York City, and he will tell us a little bit about himself.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris, and thank you all for being here on a Saturday. I'll tell you, it's hard to do Saturdays, particularly in the fall in the South because of college football, but this year it may be easier. Still, I know that Saturdays are, for many of us, the clergy and lay people included, our day off and sort of sometimes our Sabbath. So I know that sacrificing a Saturday morning is significant, and I appreciate so much you all being here. It really is a sign of your commitment and passion about the church, and it's not just surviving but thriving. And so I'm grateful. I'm going to share my screen with you, and it's sort of how I do teaching at Hartford Seminary, and just walk through a little bit about who I am and who we are, and I want to tell you the story of the last 2 churches that I pastored, and tell you that as a sort of parable that hopefully will be applicable to your church, and we'll see. All right. So I'm really glad to be able to work with Chris and the foundation, and through that to be able to work with you all. I've done a great deal of work with United Church of Christ congregations, particularly sort of in the nearby suburbs, the particularly larger churches there in like places like Western Springs and so forth. And loved coming to Chicago, and had looked forward to coming to Chicago this day and being with you. In fact, my youngest daughter lives there in Chicago, and we had planned to go early and have a little bit of fun together. So I hate that I'm not there with you in person. These kind of presentations are always so much better when that's possible. But we're learning new things. And so what I hope we will do, both today and in the 4 sessions, is model a little bit of what you can do to help with your online congregations. So we'll do what we say and say what we do, I hope. Though I'm a member of the United Church of Christ and am very grateful to them, I spent most of my development life as a young person in the United Methodist Church. In fact, I grew up in the church that you see on your screen. It's First United Methodist Church in Statesboro, Georgia. And it was a fairly good-sized church, about 1,300 members, very liturgical, very formal. And the fascinating thing about that is that the year between my first year in seminary, or the summer between my first year in seminary and my second year in seminary, I was at home with my family, of course, and the senior pastor of this church asked me if I would fill in for him for a month during the summer while he had back surgery. And so I was glad to be able to do that. But I did know it was sort of a strange thing to be preaching to your own family and to the people who saw you grow up and with whom you went to high school and that sort of thing. And what was really strange about it is that the senior pastor didn't return for another 18 months. So for 2 years, I was the pastor of my home church, or acting pastor of my home church, which was a very interesting experience. But the good thing about it is it was a fairly good-sized church. And so I got some experience pastoring a multiple staff church, and that experience served me very well in my career. I went to Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta and was a member of the South Georgia Conference. I started very, very young. So I've been doing this a long, long time because I'm now old. But I actually was licensed to preach in the United Methodist Church in 1973. I graduated from high school in 1972. So I went through this course of study to be able to be licensed to preach, because there was a severe shortage in the South Georgia Conference of ministers. And so though I was only 19 years old, the bishop appointed me to a circuit of 3 small churches. And back then, on Friday afternoon of annual conference, the bishop would read the appointments, and sometimes I didn't even know that I was actually going to these churches for certain until the day before. And when he read my name and the charge, he said, these are small churches in South Georgia, and even Mr. Piazza can't kill them. So I thanked Bishop Cannon for that vote of confidence and went out and served 3 small churches and worked my way through college and seminary as a United Methodist pastor in the South Georgia Conference, and was very, very grateful for that experience. The United Methodist Church and I parted ways in 1981 actually, because I'm a gay man and had been a gay man my whole life. I suppose if they had known that, they never would have ordained me, but it wasn't anything I knew at the time or had accepted or acted on. But in 1980, I met the person that I fell in love with and who I married eventually. And we loved and lived together for 36 years until he died a few years ago of cancer. And when I became gay in reality, that's when I had to leave the Methodist Church. And so I began pastoring in the Metropolitan Community Church, which is largely an LGBTQ denomination. And when I was the pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church in Dallas, Texas, that church joined the United Church of Christ. And that's how I became a United Church of Christ pastor. So, but I am still, as I secretly tell my friends, Wesleyan in my heart. So I do understand the Methodist Church, I think, pretty well. My parents are still members of the Methodist Church, that same Methodist Church, and I still have a great love and affection for it, and appreciation for so much that is United Methodist. It shows up in my ministry way more than the UCC pilgrims would ever admit. Right now in my life, I am, as Chris said, the senior pastor of Broadway United Church of Christ. It is a small congregation, but a very historic one. The Broadway United Church of Christ was in the mid-19th century, the largest, or one of the largest Protestant churches in the world. It was one of the first mega churches. They had averaged over 4,000 people and had the Broadway Tabernacle, where Charles Finney preached, and it was a thriving church back then, and continued throughout to be a very socially progressive church. They were abolitionist. In fact, one of the buildings of the church was burned to the ground because they were abolitionist. They were a part of the women's suffrage movement and part of the civil rights movement, and they've been that kind of church all along. And now they call themselves a church without walls, which means that they sold that gargantuan building where the first Broadway theater was housed, and have used that money to be a church that supports other churches who we partner with. And so right now, our Church Without Walls is being experienced by being an online virtual congregation. And since we worship at 5 o'clock Eastern time on Sunday afternoons, you can come and visit us anytime, because you probably are done with your nap and your church service by then. We'd love to have you. I started Agile Church Consulting as a request sort of our denomination. Our denomination asked me to do something about revitalizing traditional churches. So Agile Church is not a part of the United Church of Christ formally, because, as the president back then said, being a part of a denomination doesn't lend itself to agility. And so as a result of that, we separated, or a separate organization that serves not just the United Church of Christ, but we have churches in the Lutheran Church, the Unitarian Church, the Disciples of Christ, the Presbyterian Church, and a couple of United Methodist churches. So we're glad to be able to be with you today. And I also founded the Agile Technology, which is a separate organization that focuses simply on helping churches get better technology. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because I think these days that's the critical piece. And finally, as if my life wasn't already busy enough, I teach at Hartford Seminary, and I teach congregational renewal there. And in fact, this fall, the class I'm going to teach there is called Church Without Walls, Lessons from COVID-19. And I'm going to talk about how, when we had to suddenly all go online, the things that we learned, and one of the secrets I think that we learned was that all of our talk about churches not being able to change, not being agile, not being responsive, were disproven. Because churches large and small around this country suddenly, from one week to another, had to find a whole new way of being and doing churches. And I think the future of that is going to be a hybrid model of in-person worship and online worship. And we're going to need to learn to do both of those things. And so that's the class that I'm teaching this fall at Hartford Seminary. And it's going to be online. So if you'd like to find out more details about some of the things we're going to talk about, you can do that. So I stay pretty busy. Part of it is that the sort of grief I've experienced after my partner's death has left me a lot of extra time. And rather than use it to feel sorry for myself or to grieve alone, I've tried to fill it by staying very busy helping traditional churches thrive. That's really what I mean by vintage churches. So this telephone has been the sort of symbol of what I mean by that. When I have two daughters, and when they were teenagers, one day they gave me a present, and I pulled it out of the gift bag, and it was the handset like that of my grandmother's phone. And I looked at it and thought, okay, well, and the girls, as teenage girls tend to do with their fathers, rolled their eyes at me and reached across and pulled it the rest of the way out to show me that this handset plugged into my iPhone, into my smartphone. That's what I mean by vintage church. Pews, stained glass windows, even hymns and organs, all of those things can be valued by millennials and the coming generations, and in many ways are. But they have to be able to plug into where they live. We have to learn to live in this world of technology, I think. And so I wrote the book, The Vital Vintage Church, which I think all of you are going to receive a copy of, thanks to the foundation. And it is about how traditional churches, in the sense of churches with, pews, and this book isn't for dinner congregations or emergent congregations. Those are perfectly valid and I think vital expressions of the Church of Jesus Christ. But my concern, my energy, my passion is around the traditional church, the church that most of you worship in or pastor. And so this is some of the things that I learned pastoring very, very traditional churches, and figuring out how to get them to thrive. So I'm grateful that you'll be able to read this. And I said to Chris, if you read it and it's helpful, and you'd like your entire stewardship committee or your entire board of directors or your entire council and ministry to read it, we are more than happy to send you copies of it at cost. So we'll just direct ship them to you, and the only thing we ask is that you pay what they actually cost me. So I think that's usually $5 or less. So we're happy to do that. So let me tell you just a little bit about the last two churches that I pastored and how this might inform what I have, I think, to share with you. And so in 1987, I went to Dallas, Texas, to a fairly small congregation. Well, it was a medium-sized congregation of about 180 to 200 people. And over the 22 years that I was there, that church thrived. It grew to be perhaps the only liberal, progressive, inclusive mega church in the South. And so it was just a phenomenon. And I have to say about that pastoral experience that if I did anything right there, it was unconsciously competent. That is, I didn't actually know what I was doing that was right. It was my instincts, and it was my experience in the United Methodist Church, from taking that small circuit of churches and then serving two more churches, one a fairly decent size. Two of the three appointments that I served in the South Georgia Conference were named Charge or Church of the Year because they thrived. And so what I learned about growing churches, I learned from the United Methodist and then just learned to apply it in the United Church of Christ. So the Cathedral of Hope there on the left was sort of a phenomenon in Dallas, Texas. After being there over 20 years, the denomination came to me and said, can you help us figure out how to revive our churches? Because like every other mainline church, the United Church of Christ is in a serious season of decline. And what I said to them then was, I don't know if I know anything. And they laughed, of course, because one of their largest churches I had helped to grow. But I'd been there so long, I wasn't sure that what worked in Dallas would work anywhere else. So to make sure, I took them up on the consulting job, but I went back home to Atlanta. And there was a church there, the one you see there on your screen, the Virginia Highland Church. It had been a Southern Baptist church, which is exactly what it looks like. And they had gotten kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention because they ordained women as deacons. And so they became a United Church of Christ congregation. And they were down to 23, 24 people on Sundays and really didn't have the money to afford a pastor. So I made a deal with this church in 2011. I said, I'll come and be your pastor for free if you'll let me experiment and see if I can figure out how to grow a church in the 21st century. And so that was our arrangement. And so I moved back to Atlanta in 2011 and was the pastor of this church for about 7 years. The Cathedral of Hope was a phenomenal experience, and I would love to share all of that with you. That church grew from the late 80s through to the early 2000s in a phenomenal way during the worst of the AIDS crisis in Dallas. We had over 1,500 funerals. And yet, as you can see with your own eyes, that church still learned to thrive in the midst of that. Most of my work these days is in New England, and lots of times New Englanders will say, well, you don't understand how hard it is to grow a church in New England. And, people are just hostile to religion. And what I say to them is, I helped to grow the largest LGBTQ church in the world in Dallas, Texas. Believe me, I understand opposition. There were many Sundays that I had to wear bulletproof vests under my vestments. I understand opposition. And yet I don't tend to take no for an answer. So the Cathedral of Hope, as you can see here, when I went there in November of 1987, their average attendance was 180. And by the time I stopped being their pastor in 2011, the average attendance was 2,218 with about 4,000 members. The budget at the Cathedral of Hope during my time there, when I went, it was about 180,000. In 1987, if you remember, was in the midst of a very difficult recession, and they weren't even making that budget at the time. And in fact, 12 of my top givers over the course of my time there, 12 different top givers died of HIV/AIDS. And so it was a challenging time in which to try to grow a church or to raise money or to build your stewardship. But over the time there, their budget, by the time I was finished there, was about $4.5 million, and they had built $11 million worth of buildings on a huge piece of property during that time. When I went to the Virginia Highland Church, I wasn't nearly so optimistic about what we'd find there. They weren't paying me, and so it was. They said, "Why on earth would you come here when you could go anywhere for that salary?" And what I said to them was, this is sort of crude, but what I said to them was, "You are a good franchise." What I meant was they had a good location and a good identity and a good opportunity to serve the community where they were. I believe that from my own assessment, and I finally was able to convince them. But as you can see, that building, when I inherited it, was in very bad shape. On my right, I guess it's your right too, you can see the steeple, and you see a window there missing. That window fell out and crashed to the ground, would have killed somebody if it had hit them. So this was their situation. They had absolutely no money and a building which was completely falling apart, and had to be sort of my first priority, because who was going to come to a building that looked like this? Yet, though there were 23 people in March of 2011 when I arrived, by the time I left in 2017, their attendance was averaging 206. So this is really the church that I want to talk to you about, because probably few of your congregations can really relate to a $4.5 million budget at the Cathedral of Hope. But your church may be able to relate to this one, an attendance of 23 and a difficult challenge with buildings and those sorts of things. The budget of the Virginia Highland Church when I went there in March of 2011 was $65,000, and when I left was $1.3 million. Now, I should confess about that 1 million of that 1.35 million was really a gift. We raised the money for it, a financial gift for our homeless ministry. So we had $1 million homeless ministry, and our budget actually went from $65,000 to $350,000 that we were easily making. And I hope to be able to share with you some of the principles that got us there, because I think that would apply to your church too. As you can see, this church that had only 23 people began to thrive, and it thrived in an amazing way. It was multiracial, it was very diverse in every single way, and almost all of the congregation was substantially younger than me. I jokingly say that there was Miss Blanche, who was now 97, and then there was me, and then there was everybody else, younger couples with children, and people that folks said wouldn't come back to a church. But I want you to see how traditional this church was, how vintage it was. We wore vestments, we served communion every Sunday, we processed, we had a robed choir and an organ, the stained glass windows, all of the sorts of things that traditional churches have. And yet, young people continue to come and attend. And so I'm very, very proud of what happened in this church. And I want to talk to you about how it happened. And hopefully some of the principles will be applicable. One of the things that is important, I think, in the course of what we did there and what you and I have got to do now, I learned from Robert Schuller. When the Cathedral of Hope got over 1,000 members, none of the other really large pastors in the South were interested in helping me grow that church. But Schuller, despite how his ministry ended, was willing to be helpful. And so we took our entire leadership team to the Cathedral of Hope, or the Crystal Cathedral, to learn from him. And his architect who built the Crystal Cathedral became our architect at the Cathedral of Hope. And when Robert Schuller went to New York City and asked Philip Johnson to build a glass cathedral in an earthquake-prone area of the world, Philip said, "How on earth are you going to raise the money to do that?" And Schuller said, "I will build it with a mailing list." If he were to answer that question today, he would say, "I would build it with a database." And that really is one of the pieces of technology that is crucial for our churches to learn how to use. Our databases, our websites, electronic giving, all of those things need to be connected and leveraged for the future. I also want to talk a great deal about the impact that coronavirus has had. I don't think any of us yet know what the future is going to look like, what the future of schools, what the future of restaurants, what the future of church is going to look like in a post-coronavirus world. But I think we can be prepared, and that's the key to being an agile church. It isn't that you know all the answers. It isn't that you have it all in a row and ready to go. It is that you learn the skills and you gain the information that you need to be agile, adaptable. And the coronavirus has proven to us that we can. Sometimes we don't always do it perfectly, but we can adapt. And I hope we will learn to do it even more. So what we'd like to do now is invite you to go into breakout groups and for just 5 minutes to address this particular question. What this will do is help to shape these future presentations that we will make. What is your most burning question? What are you asking today, particularly around the issue of stewardship? How can we figure out how to do stewardship in the 21st century and in a post-COVID world? What is it that's challenging you right now? So what will happen in the forthcoming sessions is that I will do a presentation similar to the one that you're seeing today in terms of using slides and multimedia and stuff. But the other thing I want to do is use video clips. And in Zoom, video clips begin to degrade because it depends on your particular internet and how well it's working at that time. So what I'd like to do is pre-record the whole presentation, and so that you can watch. What you'll watch is actually a video, so it'll be seamless, hopefully. And at the end, we will have a Zoom breakout session, and I'm willing to be with you for as long as you would like afterwards, and answer your questions and interact and deal with the material that we presented. So hopefully the technology will be easier. And what will be really easy is if you want to invite your entire stewardship team to be there, or your entire leadership team to be there, they can also participate in the video. And so that's how we'll be doing it in the future. So people always ask, how did the Cathedral of Hope explode into a mega church during the AIDS crisis and in a very, very conservative place? Media came from all over the world to ask me that question. How did the world's largest LGBT church, how did a liberal mega church come to be in Dallas, Texas? And then recently, people have watched what happened with Virginia Highland Church, and since I've left, continued to happen. They continue to thrive. I wanted to know sort of how this happened, and so hence I've written a couple of books about it and do this sort of work. But the secret, of course, is that the definition of crazy is doing the same thing and expecting different results. And that's so often, it's never more true, I think, than in churches. Let's just admit it, that we keep doing the same things and thinking that if we double our effort, or if we add additional staff, or if the results will change. And I think we've got to learn some new skills. And COVID actually forced us to do that. And for that, I am grateful for all of it. It has sort of forced us to reinvent ourselves in a technological way. What has been really interesting is for the 6-7 years I've been teaching at Hartford Seminary, the thing I've taught the most over and over and over is that we've got to learn to live in the 21st century. And that means we've got to learn to use technology. We've got to learn to use our database to do pastoral care. We've got to learn to use our website to do marketing, not just to be an online static brochure, but actually to do marketing, or the old word evangelism. We've got to learn to use our website to raise money, and to use technology to raise money. We've got to move from a pledge drive to recurring giving. And in fact, my hope is that during the course of this course, you will discover that you have done your last pledge drive. You don't need to do that, because what happens with pledge drives is we've begun to try to squeeze more and more blood out of fewer and fewer turnips, or to get more money out of fewer people. And it is just this running constantly just to stay in place. There is a better way, and I want to talk about that. But we're going to have to reinvent stewardship, in other words, and it's going to take technology. So I've been teaching this for 7 years, and suddenly COVID comes along, and everybody has to go online. And then suddenly everybody's calling me, and I'm this genius because of what I've been saying for 7 years to them. Suddenly now they're like, oh yeah, I guess we do need to learn this. And and they are. And the churches that are thriving right now in the middle of COVID are the ones who listen to that advice from not just from me, but from other people, or found the wisdom of beginning to use technology prior to this. And those of us who didn't are struggling with it. But it is this sort of like, if you don't reinvent yourself, this is who you become. I mean, when Blockbuster was thriving, who would have thought they'd be bankrupt? Or Kodak is coming back now in a totally different way, but went away as a film company. And you had to pry a BlackBerry out of Barack Obama's hands when he was elected president. But who on earth uses a BlackBerry now? If it can happen to these companies, it can happen to the church if we fail to take the challenge to reinvent ourselves. Reinvention is really the key. You know, a lot of times churches have butterflies in stained glass windows, and the butterflies are symbols of resurrection, but they're not really, because the butterfly doesn't really, the caterpillar doesn't really die when it goes into the cocoon or weaves the chrysalis around itself. But what it does is during that time, it reinvents itself as a new creature. I'm hoping that COVID will allow us this time, this cocooning time, and that what will emerge will be a whole new creature where our churches will be able to fly rather than crawl upon the ground. I am hoping the lesson of the butterfly, which has always been valuable to the Christian church, will be our lesson too. But we do have to reinvent ourselves. And I just want to say, it is never too late. If I can do it, so can you. When, you know, after having pastored for all those years, when suddenly the denomination came along and wanted me to work as a consultant, I didn't know anything about that. Or as a professor, I had no clue. And this year, this semester, in the fall, I'll be teaching online. Who ever did a graduate course for doctoral students online until now? So I just want to say that if I can learn these new skills, so can you. And I know, I get it. I have hated having to take my course and create an online syllabus. I've hated it. But it's what is necessary to get the information out. And so I want to just challenge you that if I can do this reinvention, so can you. The other book you're going to receive from Chris is called Fishing in a Shallow Sea. And it's my latest book, and talks about the technology in more detail, because it just is a very, very recent book. But I want to tell you what I mean by fishing in a shallow sea. Because I teach this and am a consultant, I've had lots of media call me and say, okay, what is the church going to look like in a post-COVID world? Hartford Seminary just got a gigantic grant. It was actually Hartford Institute. We just got a gigantic grant to study this very thing. Which churches survived and which churches thrived in COVID. And it's a 5-year grant, so we want to see how that looks 5 years out. People ask me this question, and I just want to tell you, I don't know. No one knows. I mean, we would just be making it up. And so that's one of the challenges. Who knows what church is going to look like after this is over? And we just can't quite predict it. But if it continues to look like it did before COVID, the prospects are not very good. I don't know if you can see this, but the dark blue line, the top one, is the decline of the United Methodist Church. The purple line is the decline of the United Church of Christ. We started lower than you did, but the decline has been pretty precipitous. And if we don't change it, what I like to say is there are going to be more Elvis impersonators out there than there are going to be United Methodist churches or United Church of Christ. There are 40,000 40,000 Elvis impersonators in the world, by the way. So the chart here before you shows that sort of the decline of all of the churches, not just mainline churches, but other churches. You'll notice that the more evangelical churches have shown some increase. The Roman Catholic Church has shown some, but 100% of their increase has been immigrants. They really, without the immigration from South America, Mexico, Central America, the Roman Catholic Church would show substantial decline. The one group that has shown a little growth, ironically, has been the Unitarians. And so I've studied the Unitarians. We have a couple of churches that are our clients, but I will tell you what has helped the Unitarian Church and will help the United Methodist Church, I hope. that once you sort of resolve the issue that has been the thorn in the side of the United Methodist Church since 1972, I hope that United Methodist congregations, wherever they come down on either side of the issue, that it will free these congregations to do what the Unitarians have done. They couldn't agree on lots of things because they're Unitarian Universalists, but what they could agree on were 7 core principles. Now, being a liberal denomination and a humanist denomination, the core principles they decided on were things like environmentalism, that saving the earth was one of their core passions, and they shared that. It was the equality of all humanity, and they all shared that, and on and on. And so they came up with 7 very sort of progressive values, actually core values, that they could all agree about. And they got behind it, and as a result of that, that entire denomination has turned around just slightly. At least they have slowed the decline. And I'll just say that it's one of the principles that has to happen for all of our churches. We've got to figure out who we are, where we are. You don't have to be like the Broadway United Church of Christ or like the Virginia Highland Church or like the Cathedral of Hope, but your church has got to figure out who it is, where it is, and it's got to be the best of that right there. And stop this sort of like trying to be all things to all people. That's what has, I think, saved the Unitarian Church. Not all Unitarian churches are being saved, of course. There are still significant ones that are declining. And as William Gibson says, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I think there is a future for United Methodist congregations, though that future won't be evenly distributed. It doesn't mean that all of our churches are going to thrive. I want to close by saying, acknowledging that church growth is harder than it has ever been in my lifetime. I've been a pastor for 45 years, and this is the hardest time that I've ever experienced. The Virginia Highland Church, it grew from 23 people to 200 people, but there was a long period of time when I thought I had lost my touch. I was going to be an utter failure. It was harder and longer than anything I've ever done. And the Broadway congregation was just beginning to turn around when suddenly COVID hit and people fled the city. I don't know what that's going to look like when we come back together next Easter, probably. But I do know that it's going to take a lot of agility to create a congregation in the post-COVID world. And so I'll be interested in telling you what I learned. Tom Hanks in A League of Their Own, saying it's supposed to be hard. If it wasn't hard, everybody would do it. It's the hard that makes it great. And so your job of renewing a church, of reviving a church, of sustaining a church in a post-COVID world is going to be hard. But the hard's what makes it great, what makes you great leaders. So I want to just mention 3 things that I discovered as I began doing this work of renewal in the 21st century. First, I think our churches are all going back to what I call the new normal. After World War II, Methodist churches, congregational churches, Baptist churches thrived. But that hasn't always been the case. If you'll notice this chart, back in the beginning of our country, and I'm sorry, I think the years are missing from it, so I'll have to correct it. The 17% on the far left was from the 1700s. What this means is that only 17% of the people in the 18th century identified as church members. In the 34, 37, 35, the 37 is in the middle of the Civil War. In that part of the 19th century, that was about the average of attendance. World War I, World War II, I think were catalysts for the Protestant church in America. And I think mainstream Christianity is not going to die, but it is going to go back to a more 19th century model. That is, we will probably settle into about 35 to 40% of Americans going to church, identifying as church members, participating. So what I want to just say is, yes, churches are going to close. Hopefully not yours, but some are. And so we are probably going to go back to a new normal, but Christianity and Christendom is not going to end. It is not going to die. And it may be that something like the COVID pandemic is the stimulus for a revival, for a great awakening. Who knows? But it's not going to happen by accident. It only happens if we are active participants. The second thing that I have discovered in studying churches is that when you go in and look at their history, So what the story is that during World War II, the men went off to war, and the women went and worked in the factories and the offices and those sorts of things, even the farms. And then the men came back and took those jobs back, and women went home and had babies, and these ex-soldiers took their wives and their babies and went to church, and that's why the church thrived in the 50s and early 60s. It isn't true. What really is true, as I studied these histories, is that all of that about men coming back and taking the jobs, and women didn't go home and have babies. So they did, but they, women had learned that they had skills, that they were able to run this country on a grassroots level in many ways better than men. And so they didn't go home, they went to church. Suddenly there was this influx of every church. So there's this boom of building and growth and new missions and new ministry and new money throughout the 50s. And we sort of take credit for the war and being that boom in the church. But what really happened was women went to church and started these ministries and programs. And while the name of the top, the pastor may have been a man, women came in and said, Pastor, you just go do your thing, and we'll take care of everything else. And they did. Now, in the 70s, what began to happen was, of course, women began to work outside the home, and then we have two-income families, and now that's the norm. And so the church suddenly lost thousands of leaders as those women from World War II, the World War II era, began to age out. And that's not coming back. All of those volunteers, it's not coming back. All of that energy that these young women brought from newly learned skills, it's not coming back. That's not going to be how the church revives in the future. We cannot return to the 1950s or 60s. So we've got to find a new way to do things. And the final thing that I just want to talk about is this pastor at Virginia Hine Church, we got a new database. And so the thing I've been telling everybody else to do, suddenly we got a new database. I asked my assistant to go in and move everybody into it. And so we got a database. I turned it on my laptop in my office, and suddenly this figure came up, 2,328. So I called my assistant and said, what is that? What does that mean? And he says, that's how many people we have. How? What? And so the numbers on your left, we had about 140, we were averaging at that time, about 143 in attendance, and we had 298 members. But that 2,328 number probably more accurately was around 1,600. But what that is the number of people who considered us their church. They had come often enough that we had a record of them, their address, their phone number, their giving records, those sorts of things. So this is the future reality that we're all going to live with. If you succeed in growing your church and attracting these new young couples with families, they are going to come so infrequently that you will end up with a huge pool of people, a huge sea, I would say, of people whom you have to serve while you see fewer and fewer people on Sundays. That's just the ongoing reality. In the 1960s, as a consultant, if you had said to me, we have 400 members, I'd have said, you have 200 in attendance. That's about the way it went for decades. Then if you had 400 members, and they were young, if they were older, that's different, but young, that meant you had about 100 because people come about once a month. And it just continues to get worse, particularly among young people. Now, the average age of the United Church of Christ is the oldest of any mainline denomination, so is 68. So those folks who are 60s and up, they come pretty frequently, and they sit in the same exact pews, and they put a check in every time they come. You've got that group, but that group obviously is not going to be here forever. And so the younger people you're attracting will come less and less frequently. That's just the way it is. At the Virginia Hine Church, I went to a theater one night and went out to dinner ahead of time, and we were sitting at a table and looked across and saw the person who was the chair of my building committee. I went over and spoke to him and his wife, and I said, we've been missing you. And he said, the young couple. He said, yeah, we bought a new house, and so we've missed a few Sundays. I said, this is March. You haven't been to church since Christmas Eve. And And he was startled. And I said, that's more than a few Sundays. And she said, well, surely, but no. In their minds, they were very active members, but they hadn't been in 3 months. And that is just going to sort of be the reality. And the hope is that with technology, we can retain these folks who aren't there. The clerk of my board of directors at Broadway, last year, for the last quarter of the year, was in the building maybe twice. But since we've been doing services online, he's worshiped every single Sunday. But he has to drive from New Jersey, and he does that 5 days a week. And on Sundays, he just doesn't do it. So this is the reality. I know that churches, we've been beating ourselves up because the church, attendance is going down. And a lot of times it can feel like the church is dying. But look at this graph the 400 members are still there. They haven't gotten mad with the pastor. They haven't left. They haven't died. They've still got 400 members. They just come 1 or 2 weeks, Sundays less often. So if churches go from people coming 3 times a month, to 2 times a month, your attendance has just declined by 25%. And if you're depending on that offering plate for your stewardship, your giving has just declined. Maybe not quite 25%, but very significantly. So many people say, the only place I ever write a check is to my church. And so if you're not there to put that check in the plate, then the church is missing it. So this sort of reality is something we have to learn to deal with. So to go back to this church, we never had a financial problem in that church. But as the church grew, the budget and the income kept growing and growing and growing until by the time I left, the last year that I was there, they were able to pay a very generous full-time salary to me. Out of the 7 years, that was the only year I got a full-time salary. But that was for them to be ready to call their next pastor. And the reason we were able to do that was that we didn't do pledge drives. We didn't depend on the offering. In fact, the offering we could give away every Sunday. What we depended on was all these new and young people giving the same way they pay their bills, which is electronically. And so we set up recurring giving. So what I hope we're going to discover as we go along in the next 4 sessions is how to move your church from the offering and the traditional pledge campaign to a sustaining membership, a recurring campaign, a recurring giving. And one of the things we want to do as a result of you being a part of this is, in addition to giving you the 2 books, we want to actually give you the technology to use on your website to encourage the kind of sustaining membership and recurring giving. And so I think that'll be a sort of an interesting thing. And I think on the next to last session, we'll talk about technology. And I will bring in Jim Powell, who is with us today, and who is the president of our Agile Tech division. And he'll talk about how to do some of that. Because the problem is when people come 1 Sunday less a month, you have not only diminished attendance at worship, which means you've got to figure out how to count other things. Figure out how to count, because these young people will volunteer for the food bank and may not show up for Sunday worship. But if they're the food bank on Saturday helping, does that count? We haven't ever counted it before because we always count butts and pews and bucks in offering, and that's how we succeed or not. But we've got to find new ways to count, new metrics. I always say growing a church is simple, but not easy. You get them to come, you get them to come back, you get them to stay. It's as easy as that. But the marketing to getting them to come, the programming that gets them to stay, and the spiritual formation that gets them to get involved is much more difficult than it seems. And so hopefully we'll learn some of that along the way. This is my email address, and as we go through this fall, if at any point, whether you're a participant or not, if you have questions or challenges that we might be able to help with, you can email me there. And so what we'd like to do is ask us to break out into small groups again and look at this question, because I think this question will help me develop the materials that you need. What is the biggest hindrance to your church thriving? in a post-COVID world? In other words, what is going to get in your way for your church to come back and to be awakened and renewed and to find new energy and passion once we do that? Because I want to say people long, and I'm saying this in my sermon tomorrow, people are nostalgic for things getting back to normal, especially here in New York City. And I suspect where you are, they never will. Life is not going back to normal. It takes 26 days to develop a new habit. And I've been in this apartment in New York City now for 4 months, and I've developed a lot of different habits, and so have your members. So we've got to figure out how to do what I think is going to be a hybrid church. And so I want you to consider what is going to get in your way for doing that in a post-COVID world.
Thank you so much for joining us this Saturday morning. We had 157 people register for this event, and we had 98 local churches represented and 5 people that were representing other organizations like Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministry, the Northern Illinois Conference, Kids Above All, formerly Child Serve, and a couple of district representatives. So what we're going to talk about now is the invitation that we're making to you, your 98 churches, and all of the churches in the Northern Illinois Conference, the 4 sessions that we will have with a produced video that will be premiered on 4 Saturdays mentioned in the handout, and then some consultation with Michael and his crew that will culminate in a stewardship plan for 2021. And I'm going to turn it back over to Michael to talk about that. And
So Chris is pulling it up. Let me just introduce a couple of people. So you may see on your screen Coy James there in a pink shirt. Coy is our senior consultant with Agile Church Consulting and does a lot of our stewardship work with individual churches. And so he's going to be helping me with this. He'll do a part of one presentation. There's Coy. He also will would be, so one of the things we're doing is inviting you all to send us your plan. He'll also be helping me sort of review them, and then we will be coaching folks. And so anyway, he'll be participant. So you'll get to meet him and hear his wonderful Southern accent. Coy is from Beaumont, Texas. And he worked with communication, directing communication for Abbott Labs for many, many years. And I talked him into retiring early and coming to work at the Cathedral of Hope as our director of stewardship and communication. And so he has done that with large churches. And then the last few years has been working with lots of different congregations around those issues, including some of the ones in the Chicago area, and helping them sort of develop new ways of doing stewardship. So Coy will be able to give you a lot of help, I think, going forward. And so the giving system that we are actually giving to all of you with no obligation, you can use it or not, but it's free, is something that Jim has developed, and it is a system that's used by United Way and thousands of other organizations, and will work hand in glove with your own current system and with your website. So he'll talk about that when we get to technology, but I'm glad that they're both here to hear what I'm promising that they're going to do. So if you have that PDF, what you'll see is that we hope to do 4 sessions. What we would have normally done is gather you all in the fellowship hall of one of the larger churches and had 4 separate sessions. It would have allowed us to do presentation and stop along the way and say, at your table, talk about this and see what and that sort of stuff. That would be ideal. Right now, it's just not feasible. So what we're going to do is do this as if I was in the front of that room giving a presentation, and at the end you could ask questions. So you'll watch a video of these 4 presentations, and then at the end we'll have a Zoom gathering where we can discuss it and have questions. The 4 sessions are generally about, like, we started with the theology of generosity, and while this may sound like, okay, that's going to be boring, it actually is the most important thing, because we have to begin to get at why we have these issues around money in the church. And there are some things that I think we've discovered that people don't talk about too terribly much. And so hopefully that'll be really helpful, particularly if you pastors can get your stewardship team, the whole team, to participate in this. I think it would be really, really helpful. And so we'll talk about the way people's relationship with money has changed recently, and some theories about what COVID is doing around this, and how we do stewardship in a time when there's record unemployment and the most uncertainty that has happened, certainly in my lifetime. The second thing we'll talk about is the stewardship principles, and this probably may come as a sort of surprise and a learning thing, but churches have got to move from thinking in terms of everybody giving to thinking in terms of younger people spending. Millennial generation, I think, will go down in history as the most generous generation of all, but they don't give their money. Not like my mom and dad. They sat in the same pew in the Methodist church in Statesboro, Georgia, and put their check in the offering plate every Sunday. And if they missed a Sunday, they put 2 checks. My daughters, who are millennials, they don't do it that way, but they give probably a greater portion of their income away than I would have ever expected. But the church doesn't know how to get them to be that kind of generous with them. And so we'll talk a lot about that, the move from sort of giving to spending and what that means, and why it is our church has got to figure out a way to tap into that, and the technology that'll help you do that. Third, we'll talk about technology in particular, and about what's going to take to get your congregation moved from pledging to recurring, sustaining membership, and how you can do it with older members. I just accidentally have discovered this process, and it has worked almost universally, at least in my congregation. And then finally, Coy will help you to learn the principles of how to develop year-round stewardship, so that you don't have this huge push in the fall where you have 3 Sundays where you have to preach about giving, and the people in the pews have to try to figure out whether they're coming or not because they want to hear it. That's just being less and less effective. So let's figure out another way to do it rather than continuing to do what's being less effective. So we'll talk about that. And then what we hope that will come out of that is that you and your stewardship team will think about, what is 2021 going to look like in terms of stewardship? And we will, so you can develop a plan and then send it to us. And we'll be happy to sort of give you feedback about it, to meet with you about it, to do whatever will help you make the 2021 the most effective possible. Coy is really going to help participate in that part of it. And so that's just free. We'll be your coaches for 3 months. And I said this to Chris, this program cost each church at least $5,000 a piece. And because of the generosity of the United Methodist Foundation, your church is able to get it for $125. So I hope you'll take part of it, and you'll take advantage of this opportunity. And the final thing is that we are giving you, as I've already said, the giving system, which I think can go right into your on your website, and you can use it in this sort of hybrid model of gathering but not gathering. And I think the CDC is warning that the fall may be a really difficult time, and so we may all go back to complete virtual church through the fall and winter, and you may not gather again till Easter. Who knows these things? But an agile, I think a healthy church has leadership who anticipates what might be and gets ready for it. And this technology will help you anyway. And it's free. I mean, so I hope you'll.
Michael, do you have any final words as we wish these lovely people onto their glorious Saturday?
Yes, really. Well, no, I really enjoyed doing this, and I would enjoy it a whole lot more if I could see you in person and hug your neck. But consider yourself virtually hugged as much as we can do in these days. And I hope we'll be able to see you going forward. You have my email address, mike@agilechurch.com, and let me know what I can do to help. Mike@agilechurch.com. That's why we exist. That's why I've been doing all of this for so very long, is to help traditional churches to thrive. And that's all I want out of this, is to be able to help you. So please let us know how.